Hello, welcome back. You may have noticed in the last video the sound was a little strange because uh, the whole production staff just had to be fired. And the sad part is I am the production staff. So I think there was a small problem. If you didn't notice it, don't worry about it. Let it go. We'll pretend like it never happened. But we're in Exodus chapter 4. You are going through the Bible and learning what God actually said versus what you may have been told or thought. So we're reading from the Complete Jewish Bible, and I would recommend you share and comment and tell people about this. We're on YouTube. We're about to be on Facebook. Probably by the time you see this, we'll be on Facebook uh, and Spotify, Apple Podcast. Uh, Everywhere where you can get a podcast, you should be able to get this. So join and keep moving right along with us. We're in chapter 4. We're going to read from the Complete Jewish Bible. If this is your first video, this is going to sound a little strange, but translations matter. And I can prove that in the first verse on chapter 4. So the first verse in the New Living Translation says, "But Moses protested again. What if they don't believe me or listen to me? What if they say, 'The Lord never appeared to you'?" Two questions. In the Complete Jewish Bible, it says this: Moshe replied, "But I am certain they won't believe me and they won't listen to what I say, because they'll say Adonai didn't appear to you." So he's not questioning whether they can do that. He's saying absolutely this is what they're going to happen, what's going to happen. We do the same thing. It's like, I know that's not going to work. I know he's going to say no. I know she's never going to do that. We are certain that God is limited, but he's not. And he's going to show Moses why, or that he's definitely not limited in chapter 4. So let's go. So Moshe replied, "But I'm certain they won't believe me and they won't listen to what I say, because they'll say, 'Adonai did not appear to you.'" Adonai answered him, "What is in your hand?" And he said, "A staff." He said, "Throw it on the ground." And he threw it on the ground, and it turned into a snake. And Moshe recoiled from it. Then Adonai said to Moshe, "Put your hand out and take it by the tail." He reached out with his hand and took hold of it, and became a staff in his hand. This is what they this is so that they will believe that Adonai, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Furthermore, Adonai said to him, "Now put your hand inside your coat." He put his hand in his coat, and when he took it out, his hand was leprous, as white as snow. And that's not a right translation either, but it was like leprosy. But it wasn't leprosy, it was zerat. But we'll get into that too. Uh, Now put your hand back in your coat. He put his hand back in his coat, and when he took it out, it was as healthy as the rest of his body. If they won't believe you or heed the evidence of the first sign, then they will be convinced by the second. But if they aren't persuaded even by both these signs and still won't listen to you, do what you say, or still won't listen to what you say, then take some water from the river, pour it on the ground. The water you take from the river will turn to blood on the dry land. Moshe said to Adonai, "Oh, Adonai, I am a terrible speaker. I've always been, and I'm no better now, even after you've spoken to your servant. My words come slowly, my tongue moves slowly." Do we do that? God, I'm not able to do this. This is way over my head. Adonai answered him, "Who gives a person a mouth? Who makes a person dumb or deaf or keen-sighted or blind? Isn't it I, Adonai? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth, and I will teach you what to say." But he replied, "Please, Lord, send someone else." And he's using Lord in the term of respect, like sir. Anyone is Send someone else, anyone you want. At this, Adonai anger blazed up against Moshe. Remember, we're negotiating with God when we do stuff like this. He said, "Don't you have a brother, Aaron the Levi? I know that he is a good speaker. In fact, here he is now, coming out to meet you, and he'll be happy to see you." Divine providence. He already had Aaron moving in that direction. Aaron didn't even realize it. "So you will speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be your mouth and his, teaching you both what to do. Thus he will be your spokesman to the people. In effect, for you, he will be a mouth, and for him, you will be like God." That's important. "Now take this staff in your hand, because you need it to perform the signs. Moshe left, returned to Yithro's father-in-law, and said to him, I beg you, let me go and return to my kinsmen in Egypt to see if they are still alive. Yithro said to Moshe, go in peace. Adonai said to Moshe and Midian, go on back to Egypt, because all the men who wanted to kill you are dead. So Moshe took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, and started out for Egypt. Moshe took God's staff in his hand. Adonai said to Moshe, when you get back to Egypt, make sure you do before Pharaoh every one of the wonders I have enabled you to do. Nevertheless, I am going to make him hard-hearted and will refuse to let the people go. Are we going to follow God even when he tells you this isn't going to work, but I have a plan? Then you are to tell Pharaoh, Adonai says, Israel's my firstborn son. I have told you to let my son go in order to worship me, but you have refused to let him go. Well then, I will kill your firstborn son. At a lodging place on the way, Adonai met Moshe and would have killed him, had not Zipporah taken a flintstone and cut off the foreskin of her son. She threw it at his feet, saying, what a bloody bridegroom you are for me. But then God let Moshe be. She added, a bloody bridegroom because of the circumcision. Adonai said to Aaron, go into the desert and meet Moshe. He went, met him at the mountain of God, and kissed him. Moshe told him everything Adonai had said in sending him, including all the signs he had ordered him to perform. Then Moshe and Aaron went and gathered all the leaders of the people of Israel. Aaron said everything Adonai had told Moshe, who had then performed the signs for the people to see. The people believed when they heard that Adonai had remembered the people of Israel and seen how they were oppressed, and bowed their heads and worshiped. So a few really important things. So he did everything the way God told him to do it, and the people believed him. But he had to have faith to act. God couldn't make him act. He had to do that. So he had to believe at least enough to do that. But there's a lot of negotiating and arguing with God on this in this chapter, and we really don't need to do that. So Moses says, no, they won't do it, God. I know they won't. They'll never happen. But so God gives Moses the power to perform miracles, the legitimate power to perform miracles. So this is the same stuff we struggle with. Whatever power we have is not our power, it's God in us. So when they say, hey, Brandon, can you do miracles? No, but God can do a miracle through me, and he has. He's moved people, spoke to people, changed people through words he's put in my mouth. I wasn't smart enough to come up with. So the serpent was the Egyptian symbol for royal power and authority. So Pharaoh even wore a golden kind of serpent on his head that represented the patron cobra goddess of Lower Egypt. That's why it's important whenever you have a shepherd who's going to grab Egypt by the tail and shake it. That concept is very clear to the Egyptians, and especially to Pharaoh. The second sign was related to Israel. God can take the most defiled nation or person and purify them. Because at the time, Zerat, or that kind of white skin, that leprous looking skin, was about the worst thing that could happen to you, because it was an outward symbol. The way they saw it was an outward representation of your sin nature. So it was very embarrassing. In Hebrew, the word is Zerat. It's T-Z-A-R-A-A-T. Zerat is seen as a discipline or kind of a curse from God when somebody has it. And Moses' hand represented that spiritual condition that Israel was in right now, and they needed to be purified. So the third sign was God showing his power over the Egyptian gods. He had to establish, because they had heard of him maybe, but they didn't know him. They didn't know anything about him necessarily. The whole world had gods, hundreds of them. So which one are you talking about? Show me. And also Israel was considered God poor because they only have one God. There are still in certain parts of the world, like in Hindu and stuff like that, they think that Christians are just silly because we have one God. And it's like they have a lot of gods for everything. Israel was considered, this was not considered an advantage to have one God. That doesn't make you look important or powerful if you only have one God. So it took a long time for Israel to comprehend that there was only one God. Because remember, for at least 200 or 300 of those 400 years, they had lived among it and just been exposed to it on a constant basis. So they had no reason to think there was really just one supreme God. And tradition is that they had forgotten how to speak Hebrew too. So they don't speak it well because they had been gone so long. And some think that he no longer spoke Egyptian well enough to talk to the king. That's one of the things he's worried about. But he also had little to no idea who God was either. This was his first exposure really to God. So but God begins with the simplest thing, like who gives someone a mouth? Well, I built that. I can control it too. I can give it or take it away. So how was God going to be there for Moses? Remember, this was a question on his heart because gods were very territorial. They didn't go other places. The God of Texas stayed right in Texas. He didn't go over to the other places. That's just the way they saw it. Their thinking is what matters because this is being written to them under that context. And so that's really important for us to understand how they saw it, not whether that was right or not, but just what they believed. So in Exodus 3:14, God answers Moses' question by saying, I am that I am. Equally as correct would be, I will be there, however I will be there. I don't need you to understand it, just know I'll be there. Like a lot of us when we were younger, somehow our mothers had this ability to be everywhere and know everything. We didn't understand it, but it happened. And we just had to live that way. I don't know about you, but that's the way I grew up anyway. So God has already visited Aaron. This is the divine providence that we talked about earlier, and he's already on his way to meet Moses. And this is usually where I get pushback from church people, because God is setting up a pattern that helps us see Christ in the New Testament. And so usually if I'm teaching and it's a bunch of seasoned Christians, they go, oh, hold up. But God tells Moses that whatever Moses speaks carries the same authority as God himself. He will make him like God. So when he says something, it's taken as from God. That's exactly what we have in Yeshua the Messiah. He speaks for God. Anything he says and does has the full authority of God. And he wasn't God, but God gave him that ability. He did the same thing for Moses. He could speak and do whatever God gave him the power to do. And you think, well, how's that even possible? Well, guess what? He gave that same power to you. We just don't utilize it because we don't really know it exists. And we don't really believe God gave it to us sometimes. But God saw Moses as special. He could work miracles and he spoke as God. No wonder he didn't want the job. I don't want to speak as God, but since I took the job, I accepted Christ and became one of his disciples and agreed to speak for God. I need to take that seriously. So if you're a Christian, if you follow God, you've agreed to speak for God. You need to take that seriously. I'm not saying you're Moses. I'm not saying you're Jesus. Don't go there. But he did see Moses as special. He sees you as special. Yahweh says it's safe for Moses to go back. This tells us in Moses' mind, Egypt was still a danger. He was still scared, and God was doing this to reassure him. So he loads up his family, his wife, and his 2 sons. And then in verse 21, we get where God says that Pharaoh, he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart. So it's like, well, wait a minute. Why do you want me to go do this if you're going to harden his heart? Well, I'm trying to teach a lesson, both to you and to him. So he wanted Moses not to be discouraged when the miracles failed. He knew there would be miracles and he knew they would fail. But Moses didn't quite know that, so he wanted to reassure him. So 20 times the word harden is used to describe Pharaoh's heart. 10 times it is God doing the hardening, and the other 10, Pharaoh did it himself. And sometimes we get mad at God for doing it, but his divine plan is his divine plan. But a lot of times we just do it ourselves. It's not Satan, it's not the world, it's us. We just harden our heart towards God. There is a point when we have hardened our heart sufficiently that our destruction's assured. We just can't return from it. We've closed our mind and heart and ears to God long enough. We're done. We've sealed our fate. God won't give up on you, but he will allow you to give up on him. And that's Pharaoh's situation. So at times it is to use that individual who has determined to die resisting God's will and mercy for a purpose that God will show later on to get his glory and to further his kingdom. So we may not understand it sometimes, but he will use that as a way to do things. So each time we dismiss God, we are saying, not yet, hold on. Our hearts are hardening to God's Spirit every time we resist him or say, well, that's just too tough. I don't think God really cares about that. So until almost unnoticed by us, our rejection becomes complete. We've completely shut ourselves off from God. And really hear my heart here. This is not about you going to church or not going to church. It's about you being open to the Spirit of God speaking into your heart. So you may be surrounded by God. You may be surrounded by church people and good things in God's word, but are you listening? The Shema, look it up, Shema. The Shema prayer is, "O hear Israel." Listen and obey. It's really important that we hear God's word, God's Spirit. So I know I go off on these tangents, but God tells Moses to advise Pharaoh that God sees Israel as his firstborn. Pharaoh would have understood what Moses is saying because firstborns meant everything in this culture. So who was it? Who was to be the secondborn? It's what we now call the church, Gentiles. If Israel, the Hebrew people, are his firstborn, the next one that he includes is Gentiles. So in verse 23, where Yahweh says, but you have refused to set him, meaning Israel, free, so then I will kill your firstborn. Moses is to explain that Israel is the firstborn of God, and after Pharaoh refuses, Moses is to threaten with death the Pharaoh's firstborn, the heir to the throne of Egypt. I don't know how many kings or leaders you've spoken to, but that doesn't go over very well. So now the journey to Egypt begins, and his wife Zipporah is in a bad mood. And this is one of those moments that doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you don't understand the concept of what's going on. So the tradition is that Moses knew he was to circumcise his son. God had been very clear about that. But Zipporah wouldn't let him because once he circumcised them, they identified with this slave people in Egypt. So no mother or father, for that matter, really wants their kids to be identified as part of a slave culture and a slave culture that only has one God. They were God poor and they were slaves. Who wants to join that team, you know? So Moses wasn't really a strong man either. You know, we think because he's in the Bible, he must have been a perfect man, but that's only Jesus. Moses wasn't really that strong. He wasn't leading his family. So Zipporah was mad at Moses because he had chosen this God of slaves that was only one God, and this God demanded circumcision. So you couldn't pretend to be part of the Hebrews. You had to make that actual commitment. So you know, it was kind of like, well, if you don't like your gods, just get some new ones. These gods aren't that good. The Hebrew God, like, who wants that one? So it was Zipporah that did the circumcision. The act of circumcision is called a Brit Milah, meaning cut a covenant. It is a literal cut. And circumcision is part of the requirement to enter the community of Hebrews. God sets the rules, not me. But the idea of removing the foreskin is that a piece of flesh, part of the corrupted body, must be removed, separated, and die. The usual Hebrew procedure is that the foreskin is buried. So When the New Testament speaks of dying to the flesh, it is with circumcision in mind. That's what they're talking about. So with Passover, every person who did not accept the offer of redemption are karet. They're cut off. Karet. It was cut off from God. If you didn't accept his redemption, then you were cut off. There was a moment when Jesus, the man in his flesh, was karet. He was spiritually cut off, karet, from the Father. When he cries out, "Why have you abandoned me?" He had been cut off away from the Father. That relationship had been broken for a period. So verse 27 happens before Moses began his journey to Egypt. That's just the way the Bible's written and the way it's put together. So Moses and his family leave, and the journey takes them towards the mountain of God. So when you're reading that and some of the sequence doesn't quite work, that's why. And he runs into Egypt and or into Aaron, and then they go to Egypt. It's about 200 miles to get there. They gather the elders and they just start telling them what God had told them. And this is really the beginning of the problems, because leaving sin is going to be very, very hard. It's going to take a lot of sacrifice and a lot of work and faith to believe God really wants to get you out of that sin. So that's Exodus chapter 4. I hope you enjoyed it. And even if you didn't, God wrote it. So take it up with the author. God bless you. Love God, love people, and change the world.